Welcome to this virtual talk titled From Marine Corps to Public Transit and Many Stops in Between, the Non-Traditional Path of a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advocate with Jason Smith, class of 97. My name is Sydney London. I'm an assistant director in the Alumni Relations Office, and I'll be moderating the chat and asking any questions that are left in the Q&A box. Try to leave questions there rather than in the chat. And heads up, this event is being recorded and will be uploaded to our Whitman Extended YouTube channel for those who are unable to attend or whoever wants to relive the moment and get all the good tidbits away from this event. I'd like to ask for everybody to stay muted and that if you are willing and able, turn on your camera because we love to see your pretty faces. This event is being hosted in partnership with the Alumni of Color Coalition. This network is new, and I believe this is one of our first events that we've hosted outside of Reunion Weekend. If you're interested in joining or hosting an event near you, I'll post the link in the chat for you to get signed up once I'm done speaking. The coalition hopes to bring alums of color from various eras to form a net of community and support within our Whitman circles. A little bit about Jason. Following his experiences as a Marine Corps officer and community college dean, he currently serves as the People, Empowerment, and Connection Manager for community transit in Snohomish County, Washington. In these roles, creating a sense of belonging for people he works with and leads is paramount. Over time, Jason discovered that there are surprisingly many opportunities to do this critical work and make an impact, and it just might not be in the traditional jobs we think of. For the main event, Jason will detail his pathway to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work, and what it's like to be an equity professional in today's world. He'll recap strategies he's used in the field to help him stay true to his core values and highlight the way his Whitman education has provided tools to effectively create inclusive spaces he himself would want to see in the world. Jason, you can take it away.
All right. Well, thank you very much. First of all, I'm excited for everybody to be here. Let me start with my presentation. And it's been a while since I've had to use Zoom, so since the COVID days, so give me a second here. All right, can everybody see my presentation? All right, perfect. Give me 1 second here, because I need to see my notes. And let me minimize this. So I'm not gonna, while I'm doing this, I'm not gonna be able to see you. So if there is something that comes up, as Sydney had mentioned, please make sure just to either put it in the Q&A, or if there's a pause, and there'll be opportunities definitely at the end for discussions. So I want to thank you all for joining me today. And as I put this presentation together, I tried to think about what would be most useful. And I have to admit, it wasn't easy because there are many different ways that people approach this topic. I think one inherent challenge up front is that people have their own ideas how this type of work should be approached. And I'm, of course, no different. So hopefully you'll find some value in it. And so today's presentation, I'm really breaking up into two major parts. The first is really looking at who I am and how different experiences impacted my approach to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work. I'll look at my time before Whitman, my experiences at Whitman, and then the path I took post-graduation. And then the second part is really focusing on kind of my current reflections of this work and what I see as challenges and opportunities and how I've tried to navigate it. So, and if we had more time, I would definitely have us develop community norms, especially with a group this large. It's really important that we kind of all set in the same type of terms and whatnot. Since we don't, I just wanted to share a few thoughts up front that might make this presentation today a little bit more useful for you. First, I would ask that you listen for understanding. So try and avoid the predatory listening. You know, there's probably going to be things that you're going to disagree with or whatnot. And so try to just listen for understanding and not think about, you know, how can I get those I gotcha moments. The next I would say is don't expect closure. There's going to be a lot of things that we're talking about, and there might be some topics that we're going to really would want to dig deeper on, and we're just not going to have the time. But you can always reach out to me afterwards, and we could set up more conversation. Third, if you do participate in the discussions or the chats, just understand that your words can have unintended impacts regardless of your intent. So I would just ask that, if something does happen or you say something, that you just own what you say. And kind of going to that last one, I would just ask us all to, give people grace, give them the benefit of the doubt. We all are coming here for a reason. And I think it's not to just create chaos and be mean. Um, so I think it's important that you know who I am and where I come from, so you can kind of better understand and see what I see as important. And so off the top, just the quick stats. I graduated from Whitman with a degree in history. My written exams focused on the birth of the American Republic to Civil War Reconstruction, and my orals looked at systems of slavery within the U.S., Brazil, and ancient Rome. I actually have two master's degree. I have a master's of science in administration from Central Michigan, where my capstone project examined the effectiveness of the Military Equal Opportunity Climate Survey. Then I have a Master's of Arts in Strategic and Security Studies with a focus on Africa from the Naval War College. Top of that, I actually earned my doctorate in education from Washington State University, where my dissertation research focused on understanding the lived experiences of Black male community college student veterans, using critical race theory and veteran critical theory as my guiding frameworks. And while I'm proud of my accomplishments with education, this information really doesn't tell you anything about me besides I like to learn or I've had the opportunity to go to school. So let's dig a little bit deeper. So I grew up in Cheney, Washington, where at least people who went to Whitman have a better idea of knowing where Cheney is, because usually over here, when I say Cheney, people have no idea. And when I think about where my passion started, I would have to say it was fifth grade. Believe it or not, I got selected to play the role of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. for the Salnave Elementary School MLK Day presentation. And if you know Cheney, I mean, I was one of three Black people in my school, so the odds were probably pretty good. But the speech was a recreation of his Montgomery bus boycott speech in 1955. And so this was the first time I had formally spoken in public. And I remember telling my mom about it when I got home, and she would help me practice my speech every night. And she also told me, though, about how she got involved in the civil rights movement in Chicago when she was young and showed me pictures. And this was the first I had ever heard of this. And so throughout the process of preparing for this speech with my mom, I got to hear a lot of her stories. And I still remember the day when I gave this speech. First of all, I was wearing what I considered my favorite sweater at the time, so I was pretty excited about that. But what was really cool is that I had practiced this speech so much that I had memorized it. And that wasn't expected from me, but because I did, it allowed me to engage the audience and connect in a way that probably wouldn't have happened if I was just staring down at the paper. And I have to admit, it was this great feeling. Afterwards, teachers came up and told me how great it was, a good job, and it felt good. And I remember telling my mom about it when I got home. And then this picture that you see right there came out in the Cheney Free Press. And I felt like an instant celebrity. I was able to share this with my grandmas and other friends who weren't able to make it. So, but this is really the first time that I started thinking about these issues and, the idea of inequalities and just even what civil rights meant, as a fifth grader. So then you fast forward a few years to the start of high school. And my freshman year of high school, I got the opportunity to do speech and debate and instantly fell in love with it. And I would end up doing it for all 4 years. And I took second in state for humorous interpretation in the state of Washington. Pretty proud of that. I'm still upset about the person who beat me. Debate forced me to look at things from different perspectives, though, and to really start thinking critically, even as a high school kid. And while it may seem obvious to most of us, I would say in order to be effective as a leader, you must be able to understand why people might disagree with you, why people might fear change, and why you might actually be wrong. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later. But another significant event occurred my freshman year of high school. I got the opportunity to go to a summer camp at Whitman College. It was called the Whitman Institute for Science Enrichment, or WISE program. And I actually saw one of my WISE counselors is in the audience here. So, Brian, thank you for being here. So prior to that time in my life, I never even heard of Whitman College. And I never thought, I'd ever even go there. And so what made WISE so huge for me was that it was specifically for kids of color in Eastern Washington and Oregon. And this was the first time I had been around this many kids of color in one consolidated place. Counselors were current Whitman students, and most of them were also folks of color. And so we had real conversations about, race and ethnicity. We got to watch the Spike Lee movie Do the Right Thing, which was pretty big for me as a ninth grader. And we got to listen to Public Enemy's album Fear of a Black Planet, which I'd still argue is the greatest rap album of all time. And so it really gave me a chance to start thinking about things in an environment that felt safe. And in many ways, I'd say I would consider it a awakening. And so by my senior year of high school, I was pretty sure I thought I was Malcolm X. So I tried to read any civil rights book in our library, which surprisingly had quite a few. I'd become more confident in myself, as you can tell by my pretty awesome senior photo there on the right. And going to college was becoming a real thing to me. During my 2 summers at Whitman, they had told me that if I take care of my grades, that they would take care of my finances. And so I did my part and I worked hard, applied to Whitman. And most of my friends really at that time were joining the Army, and I probably would have done the same if it wasn't for that experience. And so this picture is from my senior year, and this was a article in the Spokesman Review at the beginning of my senior year in 1992. I had made the decision to cut debate a little bit short that year so I could play football and basketball, and apparently made a good story. So I got this article, and I like showing this because this interview was done right before or right after I just applied for Whitman. And so I hadn't had a decision yet. And so in the article, I called out that I wanted to go to Whitman. And so whether or not it had any influence on me getting accepted, I do know that when my admissions interview occurred, the admissions officer, who was also one of the counselors from the WISE program, which was pretty, great for me, was holding a copy of this article. And so it was just pretty exciting to have all of that. And so Whitman kept that passion going. All right, so let's continue on here. And so talk a little bit about the Whitman experience. So I want to start off by saying that college was not easy for me my freshman year. I felt disconnected. I felt surrounded by kids who knew they had privilege. My first day on campus, I was looking for a job and I got hired at the snack bar, which I started actually that afternoon. I also got hired as a security yellow jacket, an escort that I had to work to stay in school. And in my classes, I would listen to people talk about how poor people are lazy or how people on welfare are milking the system. And as a person who lived with a mom who was on welfare and experienced food insecurity, it was really hard for me not to want to fight everybody. But the reality of it was that was not going to make me successful. So when I think about Whitman, Whitman gave me the opportunity to try so many different things. My freshman year, I was in the Black Student Union and got the opportunity to, lead our first Martin Luther King March. And then I had the opportunity to meet great speakers like, civil rights activist and comedian Dick Gregory, met Malcolm X's daughter. She came as a speaker at Tal Shabazz. And then when Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was doing his history work, we also brought him to campus. So just getting exposed to these types of speakers and ideas was great. I also lived in the old school Mecca House, which was the multi-ethnic center for cultural awareness at the time. And we had regular conversations about, all sorts of relevant topics, but we also came from it from different points of view. So this was kind of that idea where we could all support this common goal of like supporting this house, but we all had very different paths. And we also had very different fashion senses, as you can tell. I don't know why my shirt was like 10 sizes too large at that time. I was an ASWAC. I was a president for one term. And during that time, we created a speaker fund. And what was interesting about being an ASWAC for me is it really introduced me to the reality that it's much easier to criticize the system from the outside than to try and fix it from the inside. And so this is actually the photo that you see there is actually when I was running for my second term and I lost. And the person who beat me from getting that second term was my freshman year debate partner. So we still talk though, so it's all good. Um, but I think one of the bigger opportunities was when I got the opportunity to do a research trip to Birmingham, Alabama with Professor Bob Withicum, who was a speech professor. He was a former debate coach at Whitman, and he actually taught in the WISE program. So you see like all these connections with WISE for me is such a big deal. On this trip, we were looking at civil rights rhetoric and actions during the time of the 1963 Birmingham civil rights protest. And so we got to visit the 16th Street Baptist Church and meet with people who were there when the church was bombed. We also got to meet with local civil rights leaders during that time. But probably what stood out most to me was our meeting with Jamie Moore, who's the older gentleman sitting down in front of me. And he was the chief of police during the 1963 Birmingham protest. And so, if you know anything about the protest, or if you look it up, I mean, the city administrator, Bull Connor, they were using police dogs, fire hoses. It was a pretty crazy time for that protest. And so, just to be in the same room with him and to listen to him talk about his story and to listen, I could have easily have like, yeah, I'm not going to do this, but I learned a lot. I learned a lot about his perspective. And the guy who's on on the far right of the screen, who's kind of cut out, he was a former Klansman. And there was a few other former Klansmen that were there that wanted to meet and talk with us. So imagine this kid from the Pacific Northwest. This is my first trip really anywhere out of the Northwest, and to go to Birmingham, Alabama, meeting with Klansmen and former chief of police during the riots. It was quite a trip, but it allowed me to connect the past with the present in a way that was just more than reading a book. And still, even with all those experiences, though, I would emphasize that to be effective in these equity spaces, that one must be able to think critically. And Whitman debate helped me further develop and fine-tune those skills. Uh, and it was to be expected since I was surrounded by some of the finest minds in the country. Debate forced me to look at topics from sides I didn't really necessarily believe in. And in turn, it made me more effective when it came to advocating for what I did believe in because I could anticipate where people were coming from. And so I can't say enough about college debate as far as setting me up for success. And at that time, Whitman debate, we were one of the top teams in the country. So there was just lots and lots of opportunities. And so in this picture, it's from 1997, where my partner, Sean Harris, and I debated the British national team. And the topic that we debated was focused on affirmative action. And during this time, the British national team would go debate different colleges around the US, and so Whitman got selected. I should also point out, after finding this photo, I decided when I was preparing for this presentation, I looked up the British debater and I was able to find her. And so we connected on LinkedIn and started talking about maybe we should have a 30-year debate off at some point, but that's a whole other story. And so when I left Whitman, though, I never thought of myself as really doing DEI work as a standalone job. In fact, I remember telling friends at one point that I didn't want to be in a DEI role because I didn't want to be pigeonholed. There was this idea, especially as a person of color, you do anything DEI, next thing you know, that's people will only see you as a DEI person, even though you could have all sorts of experiences, strengths, and everything else. And so I generally saw DEI work as part of good leadership. I assumed that if you understood how to effectively use key leadership principles, that you could create an environment that supports belonging, equity, inclusion, and accommodation. So my first job, though, out of Whitman, surprisingly enough, was in the Marine Corps. And I remember telling some of my Whitman faculty that I was joining the Marine Corps, and some of them were horrified. I think some of them cried. And so, um, and they asked me, why would I do that? And my response was something that I learned in my civil rights class with Bob Whittingham, which was if you want to make effective change within an institution or an organization, you really need to be a part of it, or you need to be seen as legitimate in its eyes. ASWAC also taught me that too. I think too many people want to make changes to organizations from the outside, and it requires no real effort to play the role of the critic. And so, whether right or wrong, I think many people tend to side with the words of, Teddy Roosevelt when he says it's not the critic who counts. So it's easy to sit on the wall and criticize, but it's really hard to get in and try and make that change. And so I've talked with people about this, and I said, imagine if you were, if the college decided that they were going to update their curriculum, their policies, and student services, being advised by a military officer. I mean, people would think that's insane. But on the flip side, we have academics that are constantly trying to do the same thing that have never been part of these organizations. And so I think it's important that we recognize that there has to be a balance between having experience or at least engaging with those who do have the experience. I will also say, though, that being a Marine officer created an interesting dynamic for me. As a leader, I never once thought that my race mattered. I mean, I'll honestly say that I spent 20 years in the Marine Corps. I never felt that. All that mattered to my Marines, or at least as it was perceived by me, was could I do my job well? And I've led Marines in combat from all different backgrounds, and somehow it always worked. And in reality, we're all still connected, and we still have these engagement. Yet historically, the Marine Corps has had a history of racism and discrimination. They were the last service to integrate, and they just recently had their first four-star general who was black. And even when I joined, the commandant was catching flack for a statement that he made about black Marines not being able to swim, shoot, or complete land navigation. So I wasn't blind to the systemic issues that was going on. And in fact, I became an amphibious assault vehicle officer in the Marine Corps. And throughout my entire career, or throughout my entire training, I had to let people know I could swim. Like it was assumed that I could not swim. And I never even thought about that growing up in Eastern Washington because that's all we did was swim. The other layer though about serving in the military and deploying overseas is seeing your positionality as an American. So this added a new perspective to the idea of privilege and oppression. In conflict zones, the only identity that really mattered was, I was a US soldier or Marine or whatever the case may be. So, I had a lot of conflicting feelings. And so at the same time, though, my willingness to be an advocate didn't stop. I used my officer positionality to speak to my Marines about issues to force deeper discussions. And when I started my first master's degree, I really used that opportunity to do that research on the equal opportunity survey that was being used in my battalion. So I was still trying to find spaces where I could stay true to what it was that was important to me. But, with the exception of my current job at Community Transit, none of my jobs specifically focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, or belonging. But they all had opportunities to do that work. Part of what I would argue is that there's always an opportunity to do the work, regardless of your job, because the principles of diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging, uh, are all important for all organizations to thrive. So when I was at the UW, worked on creating a holistic college admissions for a graduate program. When I was at the community college, it was working on, creating a nursing program that would serve the critical need of the workforce that was more reflective of the patients they were serving. I worked on creating collaborative ecosystems in the city of Detroit when I was just the Corporation for a Skilled Workforce. And then even just working as HR for a city or working as a consultant for Crux, it was, how do we create fair hiring practices? And so these are just some examples of the work I did that allowed me to remain true to my passion, even if the work itself didn't specifically call it out. So I think, we're to the point of like, what is it like doing equity work in today's environment? As what was just discussed, like it's pretty hard. And I would just say, even in the best conditions, this work can be challenging. So when you look at like the average, the burnout rate of people who are doing direct DEI type work, they're usually not at their jobs for more than 3 to 5 years before it becomes a lot because you're taking on a lot. Um, and it's really never enough. Like you can't stop to rest. And I just look at kind of some of the history behind this. When we think about like critical race theory, it started to take shape around the 70s and the 80s. And it was really influenced by the before that, which was the critical legal studies. And that was really this was the post-civil rights era, seeing loss of gains that were made from the civil rights era, from the movements of the 50s and the 60s. And so they wanted to have this way to respond. And so the children essentially of those who were in the civil rights era were like, we got to do more. And that's how we got this idea of like critical race theory. But then even now, what we're seeing with current equity work, that it's still pushing the idea that maybe current critical theories aren't necessarily doing enough, or they don't have enough, or they're not addressing enough. And so there's always going to be something to build upon that. And that's a good thing, right? So even in my own research, It was looking at, veteran critical theory and critical race theory in a lens that really created this whole idea of Black critical veteran theory. So, uh, this is probably going to be the most controversial part of my whole presentation. Just knowing some of my friends that are on here, I have some different views on things, and I think there are things that I think that can make this work difficult. And when I talk about making it difficult, I'm looking at it from the point of view of someone who's trying to either start meaningful dialogue or work with the people who need the most help. This list isn't any specific order, but let me go through. So the first is really, telling people that they're inherently racist when they show up to a training. I've been in trainings where this has occurred, and I think when you start off that way, you're never going to get dialogue. You're going to shut people down. I tend to believe, and maybe I'm too optimistic, but I tend to believe that most people want to do the right thing, but they generally just don't know how to. And so trying to give space for people to engage, it goes back to that listening for understanding, but starting off, as confrontational as that is problematic. I also believe that we overuse the term white supremacy too much. Uh, I think for me it could be a generational thing too, and where I grew up. I mean, growing up in Eastern Washington, close to northern Idaho, we had Aryan nations, and so the idea of white supremacy to me, was really like seeing the skinheads, seeing the Aryan nations, and having interactions with that. I understand where, what the point is behind it, and I'm not even against the ideas of like, using the term. I think the problem is though we try to engage in conversations that have require very nuanced understanding of things that people don't have on the average, user. And so again, it creates to that shutting down effect. Another thing too is that I see happen a lot is this assuming you're going to be respected or trusted because of your title or your degree. A lot of people think that, hey, I have a doctorate or you have, this title that you're going to go in and people are going to respect. And as anybody, as most people should know, as we've worked, like respect usually is earned, it's not given. A title can give you authority, a degree can mean you've accomplished something. But when you're trying to do this work, it's all about that relationship building. And so having an assumption like that is not going to give you the access that you need, and having to be aware of that is critical. And the other thing is assuming that racism is applied equally across every system or even within the system. And I think about it in terms of like, you could look at the justice system, you could look at the housing system, you could look at all these different systems, and you could look at what does it mean to be Black in the Pacific Northwest versus, let's say, what it means to be Black in the Southeast. And when I think even about my kids and what they experience, I mean, they might be able to go, 20, 30 years of their life without having to face anything what would be considered meaningful. And then at the same time, there's kids who every day of their life, they're facing this. And even within the state, we have places and spaces that are very different. And so it's not to say that you're turning a blind eye to it, but it's just understanding that not everybody is feeling it the same way. Not everybody's seeing it the same way because it's not necessarily applied across the same way. And we just have to recognize that. When it comes to doing this type of work, I think people like to take the path of least resistance. And with that, I'm talking about that it's easy to, as a DEI professional, it can be easy to go into a space where you're going to feel welcome and just do your work there. It's easy to, not want to go to the night shift or the graveyard shift because that's just not as convenient. It's easy to not want to try and get to the people who aren't in the administration building. And this is the same, in colleges, this is the same in corporations. I mean, I see it happen all the time where we tend to gravitate towards what is easiest for us. I put on social media DEI is just I feel like 2020 and beyond created this whole level of like social media DEI where it's easy to just post things and people can get excited about it. But I would always ask, well, what are you actually doing with that? And so I know some who are doing things and leveraging that and are very effective. And I know many that just like to like put up the quote of the day and feel like that they're doing something. And then the last one I would put on here, which is, I guess, similar to the path of least resistance, is that living in that echo chamber or operating in the safe space. And when I think about what we do, as DEI folks, or just in general, like, in higher education, for instance, is, you do your research on certain things and you go to conferences usually that are with people that are doing that same type of research. You share those ideas. Everybody tells you how great it is. You come back, you do it all over again. And those spaces are important, don't get me wrong. But I think what can end up happening is that we tend to keep ourselves around the folks that agree with us, and we're not putting ourselves in those areas that are very difficult. And even like when I think about in the military or even the civil rights movement, I mean, if we only operate in the spaces that were comfortable for us, we're never going to make that advancement. So it's important that you have to be willing to go in those spaces that are, going to be hostile. You have to be willing to engage with folks who don't agree with you. Because it's easy for me to give a presentation here today, knowing that most of you are probably not going to say anything outright horrible to me. I would hope not. But at the same time, if you did, I shouldn't be able to, I shouldn't, kick you out of this conversation. We need to have more conversations. And I think people are not doing that. And so I always ask myself these questions. There's three of them in particular. So, who am I trying to reach? So, when I think about when I'm trying to do this work, how am I structuring my work? Am I focusing on those who are easily accessible rather than those that I really need to reach? And as I said before, it's easy to just go to that low-hanging fruit and feel good, but those aren't the people that we're trying to change more times than not. So, how am I really trying to access those that need the help? Then I ask myself, why would they listen to me? What have I done to establish credibility? If I showed up and said, "Hey, I'm Dr. Smith," that's not going to impress a lot of people in some of the fields of work that I'm in. In some areas, that might be more impressive. But if I'm an outsider, what have I done to taken the time to learn about their problems, their systems? Because even as a consultant, which I've done, you can establish credibility, but it takes time. But if you're not asking yourself, why would they listen to me? Then you might be missing a lot of things. And then the last thing is like, what do I need to do to get access? It's not always going to be the person who's in charge who's going to give you the access. And when we think about power, power isn't always about from top down. Power can go from side to side. Power can go all over the place. And so understanding like who are the true influencers of the organization, who are the people that I really need to get access, and what do I need to do at? And like I think about in the Marine Corps, one of the most effective things that I ever did when I was in Iraq was go to the smoke pit with my junior Marines. Just to I'm not a smoker, but just to hang out and engage and let them see me in a way that they're not used to seeing me at. It was a way to start understanding, okay, I'm establishing credibility, and this is giving me a better opportunity to try and reach folks. So I think it's important that we think about these types of things. And so in our current, I got hired as a DEI manager in uh, December 2024. And so, I got the job, super excited. Hey, this is going to be great. And then by January 2025, a few things changed. There was the ending radical and wasteful government DI programs. There was ending all illegal discrimination, all these other things that rolled out. And as the gentleman mentioned before, it completely changed everything for how we could even approach this work. So imagining like going from having this full plan about all these things I'm ready to do to be like, I can't even use these words publicly in my organization. And so as I thought about like what has been my approach personally, I think, one of the things that I've always tried to do is creating a personal framework for myself to use. And I think it's important that you examine all the different frameworks and theories and just read as much as you can that's out there, but find the pieces that speak to you. Because learning is always good, but not everything is going to resonate with you, and that's okay. This that I'm showing is just an example of what I was doing for my dissertation. So These theories help me frame my research, and I'm not suggesting that you have to do something this formal, but I would suggest that you just look at some of that formal work that's out there. But for me in particular, thinking about like critical race theory and veteran critical theory and seeing the overlaps and like what is important to me and what is important to remember, that permanence and pervasiveness of racism is a part of our American life, and we have to understand that. When I think about intersectionality that we were talking about before, and then even looking at it, like, what does it mean to be a veteran who has these intersectionalities? But then that last piece is really that importance of the counter narrative. And this is where I think we have to do a better job is how do we get those voices out there? How do we make sure people can hear that counter narrative? And then as I was thinking about, okay, how do I get access? When I started at my new organization, it was, again, you're coming in, you're the new person. And so I really started with the idea of belonging. And so everybody wants to belong. It's a basic human need. Sense of belonging is founded in those relationships. And as I mentioned before, it's that those relationships are what going to give you the access. It's what's going to make people want to share. It's more than just having an affiliation. Too many times we think of belonging as, I belong to this organization, but it's really a two-way thing where it should feel like I'm important to the organization just as much as the organization is important to me. And as I've told people at work, like, yeah, anybody can be replaced at work, but it should suck if I have to go. And then there really should be, as I mentioned, that shared sense of mutual benefit, was what I talked about. But what I have found is belonging is a way to create conversation space that, you might not get starting with other approaches. And the other piece is you kind of have to make the business case. Why is it important? It's a critical facilitator for success in organizations. So whether it's education or community, creating belonging makes a huge difference for historically underrepresented and underserved groups. And when people feel that and they feel accepted and respected, they're more motivated to persist and to do work. And so when we think about it, whether it's in colleges, what made me successful at Whitman was feeling connected to all these things. And I think Bob Withicum, whose name keeps coming up, he wrote a letter of rec for me, which I wouldn't say was the best letter of rec when I look at it in hindsight. He still says it is. But the letter, he essentially said, I wasn't the best student, but you wouldn't find a student that took more advantage of the Whitman experience. And I think that says a lot about that idea of persisting because I felt like I belong. And when people feel like they don't belong, we're talking about actual physical and mental impacts and we've seen that too with what's going on with COVID and the isolation and what it's done for our, the kids and even for adults. So belonging is a way. The other thing that I had started working on is the idea of addressing trauma in an organization. So, trying to think outside of the box, I found an opportunity to go through a train the trainer course for learning how to be a trauma informed organization. And just as everyone wants to belong, everybody deals with trauma. And I talked about a little bit this with my group during the breakout. So when we think about like the different types of trauma, there's the acute trauma, and then we go all the way over to the collective trauma when we're looking at, race-based trauma that we carry on or people that are displaced. But what we see is again, that intersectionality about how we support equity and inclusion by also addressing issues of trauma. And so this is something that we're working towards. Becoming a trauma-informed organization significantly enhances the sense of belonging at work by creating a culture rooted in psychological safety, respect, and support. And this acknowledges that a large percentage of people have experienced trauma and that these experiences can affect their behavior, performance, and ability to connect in workplaces. And again, we were talking about this where if we're trying to shift the narrative to what's wrong with people to what has happened to this person. And then, as with anything else, though, creating a trauma-informed workplace is also trying to make a business case. And the thing I love about the trauma approach is, again, it takes out this idea of, race, gender, inclusion. It's really addressing a core issue that everybody can benefit from. We're talking about improved employee well-being. We're talking about enhanced productivity, better employee relations, but we're also creating resiliency and adaptability. And so and this is a lot of work, I should say. We have started this process. We have a 5-year plan to do this, and more organizations are doing this type of work. But I share this as an idea for, between belonging and trauma informed are ways that we can stay true to the type of work that we're trying to do, even in this current environment. And so just a few closing thoughts. Don't underestimate a person's passion. As we all shared kind of what got us excited, when it got us excited, you know, that stuff matters and that plays out. And we should try and encourage folks as young as possible to live up to those passions. But even as adults, as we're getting older, we got to still, enhance those. We've got to still get excited about it. Job titles shouldn't limit your ability to do the work. Just because you don't have that specific role doesn't mean that there's not opportunities. And again, good management, good leadership allows those opportunities that should play out. Like DEI shouldn't be a standalone. It really should be incorporated in all aspects that we're doing. Uh, you're never going to get ahead of the work. So you kind of have to accept that. Like you're always going to have something to do. You're always going to have a struggle. And the work is always changing. You have to be willing to operate in those uncomfortable spaces. And this is one where I think people can have difficulty with because it definitely can be rough. When I've been in meetings where people have like, why are we doing this woke shit? Like straight up, first meeting I had with folks. But I didn't back down. And by the end of the meeting, at least we could have conversation. But ultimately, whether it's right or not, you're going to have to make a business case. So I wish I could just say things and people did it because it's the right thing to do, but that's not always going to be the case. So you need to make a business case, especially in this type of the environment that we're in right now. So with that, I appreciate everybody's time. And for those that are around, if you have questions, I want to open it up.